He tried to protect her long before anyone knew how serious it was. For years, Tommy Lee Jones has been known to the public as a private, disciplined figure, an actor who rarely speaks about his personal life and keeps family matters far from the spotlight. But newly surfaced court records and official reports now reveal a much quieter story unfolding behind the scenes, one that shows a father taking difficult, deeply personal steps in an effort to help his daughter long before tragedy struck. According to publicly available court documents, Jones filed a petition in August 2023 seeking to place his daughter, Victoria Jones, under a temporary conservatorship. The request was not sudden, nor was it public at the time. It was a legal move typically used when a family member believes someone may be unable to safely manage their own affairs. A temporary conservator was appointed later that same month, indicating that the court found enough concern to act. What makes this detail especially striking is how little attention it received when it happened. There were no headlines, no public statements, and no media coverage connecting the dots. The process unfolded quietly, suggesting a family trying to address a private crisis away from public judgment. Then, just months later, the conservatorship was terminated. Court records show that Jones filed to end it in December 2023. No public explanation was given, and no assumptions can be made about why the decision changed. What's clear is that by the end of that year, the legal arrangement was no longer in place. Only weeks later, on January 1st, emergency responders were called to the Fairmont, San Francisco, for what was described as a medical emergency. According to the San Francisco Fire Department, paramedics arrived in the early morning hours and assessed an unnamed individual before declaring the person deceased. The San Francisco Police Department also responded to the scene. Authorities later confirmed that the deceased was Victoria Jones. According to 911 audio referenced in reporting by People, the call was classified as a suspected overdose, though official causes are handled by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. At the time of reporting, details remained limited, and officials have not released a final determination beyond what was publicly confirmed. What adds another layer to the story is that Victoria had previous interactions with law enforcement. Court documents show she was arrested in Santa Cruz in May 2025 on charges including public intoxication and resisting an officer. A pre-trial conference had been scheduled for later in January, a date she would never reach. When news of her death became public, Tommy Lee Jones did not give interviews or extended statements. Instead, the family released a brief message asking for privacy and expressing gratitude for the condolences they had received. It was a restrained response, consistent with how Jones has handled personal matters throughout his career. Taken together, these details paint a picture that is far more complex than a single tragic moment. They suggest a long, difficult struggle that unfolded largely out of sight, one involving legal decisions, concern for safety, and efforts to intervene before things reached a breaking point. And this is where the story becomes less about headlines and more about the realities many families quietly face, regardless of fame. Conservatorships are rarely discussed openly, especially when they involve adult children. They often represent a last resort attempt to protect someone when other options feel exhausted. What remains unanswered is what ultimately led to the conservatorship being lifted, and whether anyone believed the situation had stabilized. Those questions may never be publicly resolved, and the family has made no indication that they intend to elaborate further. Yet the timeline alone raises an unavoidable question: how close help can come and still arrive too late. And as more people learn about the steps taken behind the scenes, the focus shifts from speculation to something far more sobering: the limits of intervention, even when resources, attention, and concern are present. What often gets lost in stories like this is how invisible these struggles can be, even when they involve people whose lives seem fully documented. Fame creates the illusion of access, but it can also create distance, especially when families deliberately try to shield vulnerable moments from public view. According to legal experts, temporary conservatorships are usually requested when there is a belief that someone may be at risk of harm or unable to make safe decisions for themselves. They are not meant to be punitive, nor are they automatic judgments about a person's character. In many cases, they are framed as protective measures, designed to buy time, stability, or access to treatment. The fact that one was sought suggests concerns serious enough to move through the court system, yet handled quietly and without publicity. At the same time, the termination of that conservatorship months later shows how fluid these situations can be. Improvement, cooperation, legal standards, or changing circumstances can all play a role. Without direct statements from those involved, any interpretation would remain speculative. What can be said is that the decision appears to have followed proper legal channels, and it happened well before the events of January. When emergency responders arrived at the Fairmont, San Francisco in the early hours of New Year's Day, the response followed standard protocol. The San Francisco Fire Department confirmed that units were dispatched for a medical emergency, and paramedics conducted an assessment on arrival. The classification heard in the 911 audio, referencing an overdose and physical symptoms, reflects how such calls are categorized in real time, not a final medical conclusion. The presence of the San Francisco Police Department is also routine in cases involving unexpected deaths. Officers arrived shortly after paramedics, and the identity of the deceased was later confirmed by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. This process is procedural, but when viewed in hindsight, each step feels heavy with meaning. For many watching from the outside, the natural instinct is to look for a single moment that explains everything. But stories like this rarely have one clear turning point. They unfold through months or years of concern, attempts to help, moments of hope, and periods of uncertainty that never make headlines. The earlier arrest in Santa Cruz adds context, but not a conclusion. Court documents indicate that Victoria was facing a pre-trial conference later in January, suggesting that legal matters were still ongoing. Encounters like these are often signs of deeper struggles rather than isolated incidents, and they highlight how systems intersect: healthcare, law enforcement, and family support, without always aligning perfectly. When Tommy Lee Jones' family released their brief statement, it avoided details and explanations. Instead, it focused on gratitude and a request for privacy. In an era where public figures are often expected to share personal grief in real time, the restraint itself became part of the story. It reinforced how some losses are handled quietly, even when the world is watching. What this timeline ultimately reveals is not a failure of effort, but the limits of control. Concern does not always translate into outcomes, and legal tools, while important, cannot guarantee safety. Families can take steps, intervene, and seek help, and still find themselves facing unimaginable loss. As the public revisits this story, it may serve as a reminder that behind official records and carefully worded statements are people navigating situations without clear answers. The gap between intervention and outcome is where many families live, often without attention or understanding. And while the headlines focus on what happened, the more difficult question may be what it means. How awareness, compassion, and support can exist even when solutions are incomplete. What happens after a loss like this is rarely visible, yet it is often the most defining part of the story. Once emergency responses end and official confirmations are made, families are left to process events without the structure that systems briefly provide. For public figures, that process happens under an added layer of scrutiny, even when they ask for distance. In this case, there has been no effort by the family to shape a narrative or redirect attention. No follow-up interviews, no extended statements, and no attempts to explain decisions made months earlier. That absence of commentary has allowed documents and timelines to speak for themselves, which can feel stark but also deliberate. Experts who study conservatorships often emphasize that these legal tools are not cures. They are frameworks meant to reduce immediate risk, not permanent solutions. When they end, it does not necessarily mean the underlying concerns have vanished. Sometimes it means the legal threshold has changed. Sometimes it reflects hope that progress has been made. And sometimes it simply marks the limits of what the court can reasonably enforce. This is why the gap between December and January feels especially heavy for many observers. Not because it implies fault, but because it highlights how quickly circumstances can shift. Stability, even when it seems present, can be fragile. The setting itself, a hotel in a major city during the holidays, underscores how ordinary the moment was on the surface. There was no public event, no warning signs visible to strangers, no dramatic buildup. Just a call for help in the early morning hours, followed by procedures that responders carry out every day. In the days since, the conversation around the story has largely avoided speculation, and that restraint matters. Responsible reporting has focused on confirmed records and verified statements, rather than assumptions about causes or blame. That approach allows space for grief without turning it into analysis that serves no one involved. For audiences watching from afar, stories like this often resonate because they feel uncomfortably familiar, not in the details, but in the pattern: concern, attempts to help, moments of calm, and then a loss that reframes everything that came before it. Fame does not insulate families from that cycle. In some ways, it can make it harder to navigate. What remains is a quiet acknowledgement of effort: the petition filed, the temporary measures put in place, the eventual request to end them. Each step suggests engagement rather than absence. It shows a parent responding within the tools available at the time, even when outcomes were uncertain. As this story settles, it leaves behind fewer answers than questions, but it also leaves a clearer understanding of how complex these situations are and how easily they are misunderstood when reduced to a single headline. If there is a broader takeaway, it may be this: intervention is not a moment, but a process. And even when that process is followed, the ending is not always within anyone's control. And as attention moves on, the hope is that the focus remains on empathy, for families navigating loss privately, and for the many others facing similar struggles without public notice.